name is Kate Hickman, and I am a student at Utah Valley University. I am going to be speaking to you about a research project I have been involved with through the Utah Valley University Earth Science Department that was funded by the National Science Foundation and supported by a number of other partners. The title of our presentation is called Land Use Impact on Trace Metal Concentrations in Upland, Wetland, and Water of Utah Lake. This study was authored by myself, Tanee Larsen, Serena Smith, Clayton Rawson, and our mentor was Dr. Eddy Cadet. A brief introduction to Utah Lake. It is a large freshwater lake and occupies approximately 25% of Utah Valley, which equates to roughly 150 square miles. The lake has an average depth of 9.2 feet and a max depth of 14.11 feet, according to the Utah Lake Monograph of 1981. It is remnant of a lake called Lake Bonneville that occupied the western part of Utah and a few other states during the early Pleistocene period until about 8,000 years before the Common Era. The pollutants that we will be analyzing, trace metals namely, began with American European settlers that came to the area beginning in 1847. The pollutants were a result of various activities from the settlers and other populations in the area. These activities included damming tributaries for irrigation and other water use purposes, dumping raw sewage into the lake until 1958, and then land uses such as agriculture, mining, development, and industry. As far as environmental conditions are concerned, Utah Lake is a shallow lake, which means that the water column is well mixed. There is faulting underneath the lake, which contributes to the sedimentation rates, and generally speaking, the lake is eutrophic, which refers to the annual cycles of algal blooms and anoxic conditions in the lake. For the purpose of our study, we wanted to understand where trace metals are coming from. Now, definitionally, trace metals occur in nature in trace amounts. When these the concentrations of these metals are elevated, they can then become toxic. Now, two things that contribute to the toxicity are bioavailability and bioaccumulation. Bioavailability is the amount of a compound that is available for uptake by an organism in the environment. And this can be impacted by variables such as pH, oxidation reduction potential, dissolved oxygen, salinity, among other things. Bioaccumulation is the amount of that compound that has been uptaken by the organism and remains in the organism's system. So this applies most commonly to things such as fish like the common carp or plants like Phragmites. The table that you see below here displays several of the trace metals that we focus on most heavily, and it gives their average background in parts per million, as well as the health effects that many of these trace metals have in the community. As you can see, cancer is very common, but there are other deleterious health side effects to be concerned about as well. Now, we really wanted to know where the elevation of these trace metals were coming from. So primarily, we wanted to identify pollution sources by land use type to identify what was contributing most to the trace metal concentration elevation. We also wanted to correlate specific concentration elevations with land use type. So the land use types that we analyzed primarily in this study include agriculture, industry, development, mining, recreation, and wastewater treatment plants. Now, we are still in the process of analyzing the samples that we've taken. So for the purpose of this presentation, we will be presenting our preliminary results. For the preliminary analysis, we selected sites for agriculture, new development, industry, wastewater treatment plants, and mid-development. And for the purposes of this study, we defined new development as being within the past 10 years and mid to old development being older than 10 years. This definition arose because Utah is particular insofar as it's a rapidly growing state. So a lot of the development has happened within the past decade, and we wanted to differentiate between the most recent development and development that was older than that. As far as our methodology is concerned, for each site, we took samples of their upland soils, wetland soils, and water. Now, for the purposes of this study, again, we defined wetland soils as soils that were inundated for more than 6 months out of the year, and upland soils as being soils that were relatively either unaffected or minimally affected by water. So for each sample type, upland, wetland, and water, we took triplicates at random and then averaged these results to get a better idea for the site, which we'll see these results in a moment. So for our water samples, we used a multimeter to test for parameters such as pH, oxidation reduction potential, dissolved oxygen, salinity, and other variables. Then we acid digested our samples, used gravity filtration, and sent them to the environmental lab at BYU to be analyzed by their ICP. For soil, we followed a similar process. We dried and ground our samples before acid digesting, using gravity filtration and sending them to the ICP. There were several limitations to both our sampling plan and our analysis. Primarily, there was limited access to sampling sites due to private property, gated communities, or locations that were simply inaccessible, which heavily impacted our sampling plan. Also, we were unable to control environmental factors such as rain, temperature, and rocky terrain. We also had trouble with several instruments like the ICP and our core, and we had to work under time constraints, which is why we are now presenting preliminary results. So for the preliminary results, you can see these are all results from the ICP, and here we display results for copper, arsenic, cadmium, chromium, and lead. On the right, you'll see two graphs. On the top, we have the average of triplicates for upland soils, and below we have the average of triplicates for wetland soils. In every case, it is notable that cadmium was exceeded as far as background standards are concerned. It was particularly potent in both our agriculture and new development sites. And also, we would like to note that sites 3 and 10, which are our development sites for new and mid-development, were densely covered with Phragmites. This is an important point because Phragmites plays a role in sequestering and accumulating trace metals, so it could affect the results of our study. The order of elevation for concentrations was chromium being the highest, copper being second, then lead, and arsenic, and finally cadmium. However, each of these trace metals has their own background rate, which varies based on the trace metal. So it's important not to equate them. For example, cadmium, while it is the lowest trace metal as far as concentration is concerned, it was the most common trace metal to exceed the background rate by a notable amount. So it is important to keep in mind that the concentrations of these metals are relative. Also, we would like to point out that the upland soils tended to have lower concentrations of trace metals than wetland soils, which I will expand upon momentarily. Here we have several maps that illustrate some of our results. These maps display data for copper concentrations in parts per million. On the left, we have data for soil, in the middle for soil and water samples, and on the right side, we have the data for site 1 to give a more specific example. I would like to note that the maps display a trend where copper tends to be higher on the north side of the lake, generally speaking, than in other sampling sites along the lake shoreline. This trend can also be observed in our data for lead. These maps display the same parameters, so soil on the left, soil and water in the middle, and soil and water for site 1 on the right, but for lead instead of copper. Now, you can see here that the concentrations on the north side of the lake also tend to be higher than on other sides of the lake. Now, a few people may remember, and several others may be aware, that on the northeast side of the lake, there used to be a steel processing plant. So many of the alloys that were used in the process of creating steel had several impurities that would have included other secondary metals. And a lot of that, the waste products ended up in the lake. And we believe that these results pose an interesting question about the relationship between industry and trace metal concentration elevation. So the flow of Utah Lake on the north side generally goes from the east side to the west side. On the west side, we have the Jordan River outlet, which is the primary outlet for Utah Lake. So when we combine location of industry in tandem with the flow of the lake, we see an interesting relationship where trace metals are elevated on the north side, and we believe this may have some correlation with industry. However, these maps show an inverse trend. So again, same locations, but displaying data for zinc rather than copper or lead. And here we see that the highest concentrations are not specifically on the north side of the lake, again, which proposes an inverse trend as compared to chromium, copper, and lead that we had observed previously. We thought that this was significant insofar as results are concerned. For our conclusions, we had several findings. Primarily, upland versus wetland concentrations were not up to our expectations. For example, we had hypothesized that several of the sources of trace metals would have been upland, which would mean that the upland concentrations should have been higher than the wetland concentrations. However, wetland sediments seem to be concentrating select trace metals through some sort of mechanism. Another finding was that water sample concentrations were lower than both the upland and the wetland soil results. Agriculture also seems to be a significant source for cadmium exceeding the background concentration. And finally, industry may be a significant source for elevated lead and copper into the water, which seems to travel downstream and increase concentrations in wetland soils. As far as future recommendations are concerned, we will continue to analyze and test and sample so that we can expand our preliminary results and get a more final idea for our study. We would also recommend more extensive sampling plans that would include mining, more mining locations generally, since there are many that surround the lake, and more locations on the southern end of the lake, as there is a higher, there's an influx essentially of agricultural land use types in the southern part of the lake ecosystem. This could illuminate the relationship between agriculture and cadmium that we have begun to unveil here. We would also recommend studying the deposition of trace metals in the Jordan River, since it is the primary outlet of Utah Lake. And finally, we would recommend further study into the mechanism with which wetland soils seem to be sequestering trace metals. As far as policy implications are concerned, while these results are preliminary, we feel comfortable recommending that there be stricter regulations for cadmium in agriculture and for other trace metals for industry in order to mitigate contamination of these toxic metals into the ecosystem. As we had shown on the slide previously, a lot of these high concentrations of these toxic metals lead to deleterious health effects, which include cancer and other concerning problems. So it's important to keep these things in mind when discussing the health of the community. Furthermore, we would like to relate this to a current proposal to privatize the Utah Lake ecosystem and build an island or a resort in the middle. As we had shown previously in our study, development seems to be a significant contributor to mobilization and bioavailability of trace metals in an ecosystem. In order to construct an island and a resort or what have you, in order to alter the ecosystem in a way that was proposed by this project, we would potentially be mobilizing many more trace metals, increasing concentrations, and potentially creating an even more hazardous condition than already exists. The proposal to create an island in the middle of Utah Lake operates under the assumption that the ecosystem is hopeless, that we have lost our chance at reviving the system. Our study shows that it is not hopeless. What we need is to implement more active management strategies to preserve and restore Utah Lake. What we do not need is to continue development and to distinguish the ecosystem. These are our recommendations. I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed and learned something.